Good afternoon and welcome to you all. We got a great response at a very short period of time. And I want to tell everybody now we're going to have our second hearing next Tuesday on the Affordable Care Act on the Oversight Committee. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to the staff. We're holding this hearing virtually in compliance with the regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to Resolution 965. This is my first hearing as chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight, and our first official virtual Oversight Subcommittee hearing in the Ways and Means Committee. Before we turn to today's important topic, I want to remind members of a few procedures to help you navigate this platform. First, consistent with the regulations, the committee will keep microphones muted to limit background music and noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Second, the members and witnesses must have their cameras on at all times. So even if you leave for a few moments, leave your camera on. Third, we're going to dispense with the practice of observing the Gibbons rule and instead go in order of seniority for questioning, alternating between minority and majority, and beginning with the members of the Oversight Subcommittee because there are other members who are on. After all subcommittee members have asked their questions, we'll move in seniority order to off-subcommittee members. Finally, without objection, Representative Dalbene is authorized to serve as the chair in the event that I experience technical difficulties. I thank you all for continued patience as we navigate the technology in order to continue serving our country together in this great time of need. And with that, I will now turn to the important topic of today's hearing, taxpayer fairness. Our hearing today will focus on the issue of tax fairness. I welcome the colleagues. I welcome the witnesses. I must note that this is the first subcommittee meeting since the passing of our friend and colleague, John Lewis. John was the chairman and lead Democratic member on this subcommittee for the past 15 years. I selected the oversight panel when I first joined the committee in 2007 because I wanted to work with John. He led the subcommittee with the same grace and sense of purpose with which he led his life. I obviously cannot fill his shoes. And while our styles are not identical, I commit to do everything in my power to make John proud. As a subcommittee charged with conducting oversight of the programs within the umbrella of the Ways and Means Committee, our jurisdiction is very broad. Today, we're focusing on one of the most critical components of American government, our voluntary tax system. Historically, the United States has had an excellent record of compliance with our tax laws. Americans dutifully pay their taxes, assuming the system is fair for all, whether you are rich as Rockefeller or just a regular Joe. For 5 years, the president has refused to disclose his tax returns. Trump has broken with the history of every president since President Nixon and sabotaged public faith in our tax system. Since 2017, I have led Congress's effort to bring sunlight to President Trump's business and personal tax returns. The law is clear. Under 26 United States Code, Section 6103F, the committee is legally and absolutely entitled to see Mr. Trump's returns. It's our responsibility to restore the public's trust in our system by ensuring that the president's returns are audited impartially and without political interference. Our chairman, Richie Neal, formally requested Mr. Trump's returns in April of 2019. The administration, through Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and IRS Commissioner Reddick, has refused our request. They have been breaking the law for now 555 days. The House issued a subpoena. The administration refused to comply with the subpoena. That's another area that our subcommittee will be looking into. Subpoena powers under the Constitution, under the rules of the House. Consequently, the House's request for the tax returns is being stonewalled by a political partisan judge. We have plenty of urgency. Just 2 weeks ago, the New York Times reported that self-proclaimed billionaire President Trump paid only $750 in taxes in 2017 and in 2018. And in the 10 previous years, he reportedly paid no taxes. I'd like that deal. I'm from North Jersey. We have teachers, police officers, firefighters, ambulance technologists, and school bus drivers that pay more in taxes. How do they feel when they see their leader pays less than they do? A tax system that lets a supposed billionaire pay less than teachers, secretaries, and custodians is broken. That is why we're holding today's hearing. And I want everyone watching us to know, I personally invited the IRS Commissioner Reddick to join us today, and he refused. I wonder why. What is he afraid of? Why is Donald Trump afraid to disclose his tax voluntarily? Is it because we may learn that the true source of the president's so-called wealth is not clean? Or what dark figures he might be beholden to? We have an excellent panel of witnesses, like we have an excellent group of members here, both sides of the aisle. Want answers to these questions? I look forward to their testimony. But first, I want to yield to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Kelly of Pennsylvania, for the purposes of an opening statement. We've worked and served together on this committee 8 years now, and I look forward to working with you in this new capacity. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Unmute yourself.
There, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's great to be with you. This is the first hearing we've been able to do together. I got to tell you, I think all of us know that it was truly an honor to serve a Ways and Means Oversight Committee with John Lewis. He's certainly an inspiration, not just to us, but to every American. Now, Mr. Lewis led this committee with dignity and understood the importance of our subcommittee and the role oversight plays in Congress, with a focus on making government more transparent, more efficient, and more accountable to the American people. Now, in addition to being legislators, we are Americans' watchdog, making sure that their money, every single penny of it, the taxpayer dollars, are being spent wisely and to their benefit. Therefore, I'm looking forward to continuing this important work with you, Chairman, and hope we can find some common areas where we can work together on behalf of the American people. Now, unfortunately, I understand today may not be that day for this great bipartisan agreement. Today, Democrats are going to continue their relentless effort to weaponize the tax code for purely political purposes. Democrats have sought to publicize the president's tax returns since day one of his presidency, despite no evidence that he did anything wrong other than legitimately winning the last presidential election. Now, this issue was furiously raised by my friends and the other side, and amplified by many of their friends in the media, like the New York Times. And this is so much like Groundhog Day. Once again, with the exception of not being about Phil's shadow, my friends on the other side are using taxpayers' money and our time to drag us through another campaign debate that was resolved 4 years earlier. In the 2016 presidential campaign, the people spoke at the ballot box with their votes. And in my district, across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and the country. Then it was all for this administration to be elected. This issue, like so many others, is one where the resistance, including my friends on the other side who are the vanguard, and the other allies that are out there like Antifa, they cannot simply let go. They've been challenging this election in 2016 relentlessly and have never accepted, by the way, the outcome of it. Now, my friends, look, President Trump is on the ballot box, is on the ballot, and across the country, folks are going to get a chance to decide on whether he gets another term or not. Now, I'm confident they will grant the president those next 4 years, but why use this fine committee as an instrument of the Democratic National Committee? Why put everyone through this totally partisan Groundhog Day exercise? What is the substance of this politically partisan groundhog event today? Unable to succeed in this effort through proper legal channels, Democrats have been aided by an unethical and likely illegal leak of the president's private taxpayer information in the New York Times. This is a stunning breach of public trust. If this can happen to the sitting president of the United States, it can happen to any American. Let me repeat that. If this can happen to the president of the United States, this can happen to any of us at any level, whether we sit in the highest office in the land or the lowest position in society. Now, Ranking Member Brady and I have written to the Department laws were broken in the release of this information. And I ask you unanimous consent to enter both letters for the record.
Mike, you're off. Mike, your mic is off. Representative Kelly, your mic is off.
It shows. Oh, I'm on, guys.
Go ahead.
Mine's
I
on.
need to say, without objection, that will be included in the record.
That'll be included in the record, Mike, what you presented just a moment ago.
Okay, all right, thank you. But can you hear me?
Now I can. I couldn't hear you before.
Okay, all right. So okay, without objection, it's admitted. Is that correct to the record?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Now
Without
at the end of the day,
objections.
I found the New York Times report underwhelming, to say the least. The Times doesn't allege that any illegal behavior by the president took place. They recurrently state that more information is needed to evaluate specific transactions or items on the returns that the Times allegedly received, despite not having all the facts, which is never a problem for the Times for them to write any article, and the need for more information. The Times settles for insinuations with language like, this could be legally problematic. This may be problematic. That type of reporting is incredibly unfair and not objective. It just, in my book, I just can't believe that anybody would look at that article and think, you know what, this is a well-written opinion. It's not news, by the way. It's a manipulation of their outlet. Now, this type of reporting is just incredibly unfair, not objective reporting at all in my book. Well, for an example, if I wrote a $50 check to Catholic Charities and took a charitable deduction on my tax return, you could say the exact same thing. More information is needed to verify this trend, but it could and might be legally problematic. We just don't know. That's an absurd premise. Now, of course, you need a lot more information, and that is literally what an audit is all about. When the IRS conducts an audit, it gathers more information and makes determinations about tax filings. The president has said he is under audit, and the New York Times certainly indicates that he is under audit. That's exactly the way the process is supposed to work. Putting public pressure and suggesting impropriety at the IRS without evidence maligns the work that the IRS employees do and improperly puts political pressure on them to reach a particular outcome. So we're weaponizing. We know the Democrats don't like the president. I've heard 47 months of that, and are unhappy with the last election results. And we've heard more than 47 months of that. So much for accepting the results of a legitimate election. But in a democracy, we don't go after duly elected officials. Now, we don't know, because there hasn't been anything pointed out to us that the president has a serious problem with his taxes. New York Times claims to review them, and even they say they don't know for sure. We do need to let the IRS employees do their work and finish their audit. They are the only government agency in a position to address any possible legal issues. And it's my understanding that both the president and the vice president's tax returns are examined every year. Now, since day one, Democrats have tried to publicize the president's tax returns for their political agenda. Back in 2017, members of this committee claimed that we needed to see his returns to prove the president's allegedly deep and mysterious ties to Russia. Oh, that's all we heard about from the mainstream media then. Now, it must have been disappointing when the New York Times stated very quietly that the documents it received do not reveal any previously unreported connections to Russia. How sad for them. Now, since the investigation didn't produce the results they wanted, our Democratic colleagues have simply looked for other ways to weaponize the tax code. And they wanted to do it to attack a sitting president of the United States. This is a very dangerous procedure, and one that I think is going to set a very dangerous precedent. And I fear that the integrity of our tax code is going to suffer greatly as a result. As for the idea that the president did something wrong by paying a low amount of income taxes in a given year, give me a break. Earlier this year, we had a hearing on corporate income taxes, and I explained that businesses pay all sorts of federal, state, and local taxes, property taxes, employment taxes, sales taxes, excise taxes, and on and on and on. Now, as a businessman, some years I paid more in taxes than others, and other years I paid no tax. Why? Well, because some years I was simply more profitable. We pay taxes on profits. Cherry picking income taxes in any given year tells a very misleading story about a business owner's tax situation. The president has paid millions and millions of dollars in all sorts of different taxes over the year. Nevertheless, Democrats continue to suggest that having a lower level of income tax liability in any given year means that the president doesn't care about contributing to our country. Is that true? Absolutely not. The president has donated every single paycheck as president of the United States to the federal government. So far, those donations have totaled nearly $1.4 million, hardly in it for himself. I would be surprised if anyone in this room has donated a dollar more than they owe in taxes to the federal government. But this president has. Why? Going forward, I hope this committee can find constructive ways to improve the lives of the American people so that their government works better for them and not simply for political gamesmanship. I believe our constituents want us to work together to solve problems and not to score cheap political points through innuendo, insinuation, and speculation. Now, for the record, I haven't seen any actual evidence of impropriety at the IRS. I haven't seen any actual evidence of any impropriety on part of the president. The only thing we have evidence of is an unauthorized and likely illegal leak of tax.
Mike, you've got over the time.
Bill, I want you and I to work on seeing how the Times got that information. You should be more concerned about that than this endless pursuit of trying to undo a duly elected president. So with that, I'm going to yield back, and I'm really looking forward to a well-balanced panel to hear what they have to say about the president's taxes. I'm working with you, Will.
I think we're going to be hearing a lot of good things. So stay tuned. We're next going to hear from our panel. Thank you to our distinguished witnesses for taking the time to appear before us today to discuss these very important issues. I'm going to introduce all 5 witnesses and then turn to each of them for their testimony. Our first witness is Ambassador Norm Eisen. Ambassador Eisen currently serves as a senior fellow in government studies at the Brookings Institution. Most recently, he served as a special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2020, including during President Trump's impeachment. He's the author of a new book on President Trump. We know him well in controlling the ethics issues that occurred during the Obama administration. Norm, thank you, and we're ready for you.
Sir.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kelly, members of the subcommittee.
Norm, I apologize. You will not lose any time. I want to introduce all the panel, and then I'll turn to you. My mistake.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I thought you were ready for me.
I'm sorry. Our next witness will be Kathleen Clark. Professor Clark teaches at Washington University School of Law in St. Louis, Missouri. She specializes in legal ethics, government ethics, the law of whistleblowing, and national security law. She's led anti-corruption and ethics workshops around the world, has provided ethics training to federal, state, and local government agencies. Our third witness is Leandra Letterman. Professor Letterman teaches courses on federal tax serves as the Director of Tax Program at the Indiana University of Moore School of Law. She's been ranked as one of the 10 most frequently cited U.S. tax scholars. Professor Letterman was recently awarded a Fulbright research grant, and her research focused on the transparency of tax rulings. Our fourth witness is Steve Rosenthal. Mr. Rosenthal currently serves as a senior fellow for the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center at the Urban Institute. His research focuses on federal income tax issues. He previously served as legislation counsel for the Joint Committee on Taxation. And our final witness is Andy Graywall. Professor Graywall is the Joseph F. Rosenfeld Scholar and Professor of Law at the University of Iowa. He taught there since 2011. He focuses on issues related to tax, administrative, and constitutional law. Each of your statements, all the witnesses, will be made a part of the record in its entirety. I would ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. To help you with the time, please keep an eye on the clock. That should already be pinned to your screen. If you do go over your time, I'll notify you with the tap of my gavel. I'm going to let you know when there's 30 seconds left. Ambassador Eisen, you may begin.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Ranking Member Kelly, the members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify at this important hearing on taxpayer fairness as part of this distinguished panel. Our tax system, as the chairman pointed out, favors the wealthy at the expense of average folks. It cuts generous breaks for investment income and rigidly taxes income earned by people working 2 and even 3 jobs to get by. In this system, a person who earns less than $20,000 is more likely to be audited than someone who earns over $400,000. Like much else about our tax system, that makes no sense. President Trump's signature 2017 tax law has made things even worse for regular Americans. For example, that law inflicted $1 trillion worth of damage on homeowners by taking away mortgage and real estate tax deductions. This is a structure that favors those in the very top income levels at the expense of everyone else. The New York Times revelations about Mr. Trump's tax returns make him the poster boy for this basic lack of fairness. The reporting indicated that he paid no taxes for 10 of 15 years prior to 2018, and that he paid only $750 in both 2016 and 2017. $750, that's less tax than someone who earned just $24,000 in 2016 paid. Mr. Trump deducted $70,000 for hair care one year. He paid his own daughter, Ivanka, now a White House official, nearly $750,000 for what are called consulting payments. Then there is the $72.9 million refund the president received for abandoning his failing Atlantic City casinos. But it appears he didn't abandon them completely, as the rules require to get a refund. Mr. Trump may have to pay back $100 million as a result. That's the subject of the audit, of course. We shouldn't have to rely on media revelations in the 4th year of his presidency to learn these things. And many other questions still remain open even after the Times story. That's because the president refuses to disclose his tax returns, a break with his predecessors going back for decades. Now that we have the Times reporting, we do have a better idea of why he may have held back those returns. Of all the secrets hidden in them, what concerns me the most is the president's massive debt. We know he will have to repay or refinance over $300 million worth of debt in the next 4 years, and that's only a partial picture. Mr. Trump will need help covering his loans. That makes him vulnerable. He could be influenced by bad actors or foreign powers, including hostile ones. Americans have to worry about what Mr. Trump may do to curry favor with those who can help him manage his debt load. His conflicting financial interests compound this risk. The original sin of this administration and of the president was his refusal to divest those conflicted financial interests, another breach of norms, and not just norms. From the first minute of his term, he has violated America's original ethics law, the constitutional prohibition on presidents taking things of value or emoluments, as it was referred to in the 18th century, from foreign governments. The New York Times revelations raise additional questions about his foreign funding, with licensing payments of $3 million originating from the Philippines, $2.3 million from India, and $1 million from Turkey. Mr. Trump has monetized the presidency in a way never before seen in American history, resulting in over 3,400 conflicts by one count. He has hosted foreign leaders at his Mar-a-Lago resort. He's spent up to $140 million of taxpayer money on self-promoting trips to his golf courses. He's billed the Secret Service for costs associated with the privilege of protecting him, and much, much more. President Trump not paying his fair share of taxes is consistent with this pattern of self-dealing. He tells us that not paying taxes makes him a smart businessman. That is
Mr.
not.
Eisen, your time is up.
Thank you, Mr.
I
Chairman.
interrupted you in the middle of a sentence. You want to finish the sentence?
That is not right. Mr. Trump should carry his weight for this country, just as average Americans do, as a matter of tax fairness.
Thank you, Ambassador Eisen. Professor Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Kelly, members of the Oversight Subcommittee, and other members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. The written testimony I submitted discusses 3 issues. First, the conflict faced by IRS employees who review and audit the president's tax returns. Second, our need to know, what does the president owe and to whom does he owe it? And then third, the gaps in our system for disclosing the president's and other officials' finances. Since my time this afternoon is limited, I'm going to focus on the first issue, the conflict of interest faced by IRS officials who review and audit the president's tax returns, and how Congress can mitigate that conflict. These IRS employees face a difficult situation. They have a duty to treat the president like they would any other taxpayer, but they may feel pressure to give the president more favorable treatment. This conflict stems from the very structure of our government. The IRS is part of the executive branch. The president sits atop the executive branch. The IRS employees are, in effect, reviewing their boss's tax returns. This conflict is not just an academic matter. History shows that it can affect how the IRS does its job. 50 years ago, IRS employees gave President Nixon favorable treatment on his tax returns, in which he claimed highly questionable deductions, allowing him to pay less than $900 in tax, despite having more than $200,000 in income. After that favorable treatment was leaked to the press, the IRS opened a second review of Nixon's tax returns. On the second go-round, the IRS rejected Nixon's claimed deductions, requiring him to pay more than $400,000 in back taxes. Now, why did the IRS employees initially permit those improper deductions? At the time, one tax expert explained, IRS agents and their superiors would be extremely reluctant to audit the tax returns of the president as if he were an ordinary taxpayer. That was true 50 years ago, and it may be even more true today because President Trump has repeatedly retaliated against officials who follow the law, where following the law hurts President Trump. In my written testimony, I describe in detail several examples of such retaliation. Let me touch briefly on two examples. President Trump retaliated against then Attorney General Jeff Sessions because Sessions recused from the investigation into Trump's 2016 campaign. The law clearly required Sessions' recusal. Sessions followed the law. Trump retaliated against Sessions for following the law instead of just doing what Trump wanted. President Trump also retaliated against defense official Elaine McCusker by withdrawing his earlier nomination of her to become the Pentagon's Comptroller General, because McCusker had accurately warned OMB officials that the president's hold on military aid to Ukraine violated the Impoundment Control Act. McCusker reminded OMB officials what the law required. Trump retaliated against her for invoking the law instead of just doing what Trump wanted. We can't entirely remove the conflict faced by IRS employees because it's inherent in our structure of government. But Congress could mitigate the conflict by increasing transparency. If we required public disclosure of the president's tax returns, the IRS, as well as the IRS audit of those returns, the IRS would be publicly accountable for the way it handles this conflict of interest. The Nixon tax episode demonstrates the power of transparency. The IRS decided to revisit Nixon's returns only after the information about those returns was leaked to the press. I'll look forward to taking your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Clark. And now I'm not going to do the 30-second more. I understand that might be disruptive. I don't want to disrupt anybody. Professor Letterman, you may begin.
Thank you very much. Chairman Pascrell, Ranking Member Kelly, and the distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the topic of taxpayer fairness. I would like to make 4 main points today. 1, audits deter noncompliance. 2, the IRS needs adequate funding. 3, some taxpayers have more opportunity than others for noncompliance. And 4, enforcement of the tax laws is an important part of taxpayer fairness. I'll now say a bit more about each of these points. First, audits deter noncompliance. They bring in substantial direct revenue. In addition, and most important, audits have a significant pro-compliance effect on taxpayers who are not audited. Estimates of the indirect effect of audits range from about $4 to about $12 for each dollar directly collected from enforcement. It's also worth noting that tax penalties do not have nearly the deterrent effect that audits do. Audits also have an indirect on the future tax payments of those who are audited. Taxpayers who are audited and found to owe additional tax increase their tax payments in subsequent years. Research also suggests that to incentivize compliance by those audited, audits need to be effective. And of course, effective audits require resources. Second, the IRS needs adequate funding. It needs sufficient funding to have a reasonable audit presence, provide service to taxpayers who need help complying, and maintain cybersecurity. In 2011, Congress began cutting the IRS's budget. As a result, the IRS has experienced significant reductions in its staffing and activities. The Congressional Budget Office recently reported that, quote, the amount of funding and staff allocated to enforcement activities has declined by about 30% since 2010, unquote. IRS audit rates have declined significantly since 2010 as well. Moreover, audit rates have declined more sharply at the top, both for individuals and corporations. Reduced enforcement of the tax laws benefits tax evaders, not those who comply. Restoring the IRS's budget to at least 2010 levels would be a very helpful step that would bring significant return on investment. Third, some taxpayers have more opportunity than others for noncompliance. Taxpayers whose income is largely not subject to third-party reporting, such as self-employed individuals, have much more opportunity for noncompliance and statistically contribute much more to the federal tax gap. The IRS has consistently found that levels of tax compliance vary with how visible the item is to the IRS. For example, with respect to wages and salaries, where the taxpayer's employer both actually withholds taxes and reports payment amounts to the IRS estimates a 99% voluntary compliance rate. Where there's no withholding requirement, but there is substantial information reporting, the IRS still estimates a very high voluntary compliance rate of 95%. By contrast, where there's no third-party reporting, such as with respect to sole proprietorships, the IRS estimates a much lower voluntary compliance rate of only 45%. I generally analogize to a red light camera. People comply with the rules more when they know they're being watched. And where taxpayers are not being watched up front because there's no third-party reporting, the IRS particularly needs enforcement resources. Fourth, enforcement of the tax laws is an important part of taxpayer fairness. The IRS's mission is to, quote, provide America's taxpayers top quality service by helping them understand and meet their tax responsibilities and enforce the law with integrity and fairness to all, unquote. So part of the IRS's mission is fairness to all. And part of that fairness is protecting the taxpaying public. Former IRS Commissioner Rosati once wrote that, quote, our tax system depends on each person who is voluntarily meeting his or her tax obligations, having confidence that his or her neighbor or competitor is also complying, unquote. Enforcing the tax laws demonstrates to taxpayers that noncompliance doesn't pay. Taxpayer fairness also includes the possibility of more enforcement where there is more opportunity for noncompliance, even if those audits are more expensive to conduct because they cannot simply be done by correspondence, for example. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important set of issues. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Letterman. And now I'd like to call on Mr. Rosenthal, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pasquale, Ranking Member Kelly, distinguished members of the Oversight Committee and the full Ways and Means Committee. Thank you for inviting me to speak today on tax fairness. I am Steve Rosenthal. I am a senior fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. The views I express are my own and should not be attributed to any other person or organization. Every president since Richard M. Nixon has voluntarily released his income taxes to the public until Donald J. Trump. And since President Nixon, the IRS has audited every president's returns. Last month, the New York Times reported new details on President Trump's income taxes and the ongoing IRS audit of his returns. These details fill out a picture of President Trump's returns that began to emerge in earlier articles. This picture calls into question the fairness of those returns in 3 respects. The fairness of the amount of taxes the president reportedly paid, the fairness of the president's reported business losses, and the fairness of the IRS audit of President Trump's income taxes. Let me address each of those in order. First, I believe the $750 of taxes reportedly paid by Mr. Trump in 2017 was not fair. $750 is lower than the taxes paid by the average taxpayer in every income group that we might use to compare. Perhaps President Trump's tax return for 2017 represents a businessman who had a bad year. But according to the Times, President Trump paid little or no taxes for many, many years. Second, the fairness of the president's reported business losses. The Times reported exceedingly large expenses and losses for President Trump's businesses, which would only be fair if the losses were genuine and accurate. And we can't tell if they were. In the 1990s, President Trump generated close to $1 billion of losses by borrowing, spending, and losing money on casinos and other failed ventures. President Trump used those losses to reduce his taxable income in the 2000s to avoid paying taxes. However, according to an earlier Times story, President Trump omitted income as his borrowings were forgiven. This income would have reversed his tax losses considerably, as the tax law normally requires. In 2009, President Trump claimed another big loss, $700 million, which he carried back to erase income he had previously reported in 2005, 2006, and 2007, according to the Times. We can't tell without more information whether the $700 million loss was appropriate or should have been reduced also. Now the third question. Was the audit fair, or is the audit fair? According to the Times, the IRS continues to audit the president's 2009 returns, including the $700 million loss that he claimed on those returns. The IRS is also auditing his subsequent returns, 2010 and forward. Again, we can't tell without more information whether the IRS is conducting these audits fairly and impartially, but they've lasted a long, long time. The IRS often struggles to audit complicated financial arrangements and pass-through businesses. So separating the delay that is attributable to the sprawling nature of President Trump's business empire from any delay due to his status as president is difficult. But untangling the source of that audit delay is important. We have only one president, and he directs the entire executive branch, including the IRS. I encourage the subcommittee and the full Ways and Means Committee to continue to exercise its oversight responsibility over the executive. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Your comments. I appreciate your comments, Mr. Rosenthal. And now we'll have Professor Graywall, and you may begin, Professor.
Thank you. I've written and spoken a lot about President Trump's tax return information over the last couple of years, but I just wanted to take taxpayer fairness as a topic unto itself first. And I think the first thing we should realize is that really what we're not talking about today is taxpayer fairness, but fairness generally. If you are poor, disadvantaged, have uncertain immigrant status, or otherwise facing challenges in society, yes, of course, you are going to have troubles with IRS, but you're probably going to have issues getting a driver's license, learning how to vote, and so on. So really, the broad issue here is fairness, and we're talking about it in the context of the IRS. So I don't want to turn the IRS into a punching bag for the issues related to low-income persons. It cuts across all of society. Now, with respect to the tax context specifically, let me give you one anecdote that may help explain the challenges indirectly facing low-income taxpayers. A few years ago, I got a notice of deficiency myself, a tax law professor, asking for a few $1,000s from the IRS. And I could tell, I knew exactly what was wrong from the notice of deficiency, why the IRS was wrong. I prepared in my neat Word document a couple pages with the law and explanation. I got all the supporting documents, put it all together neatly. And I wrote, IRS, here's why you're wrong, A, B, and C. I sent that in. I get an automated letter saying that your assertion of D means you're wrong. I'm scratching my head. I told you A, B, and C, and you're telling me D? I'm a tax law professor. I'm pretty confident I did everything right. I then had to go to tax court to actually get a human being at the IRS to pay attention. All through this time, I couldn't go to IRS appeals. Calling in a phone number was helpless. And eventually, once a human being, an actual lawyer at the IRS looked at it, said, this is done. We just told the tax court that this is over. Now, imagine if you were a low-income person or otherwise facing disadvantages. First, you probably wouldn't be able to get everything right the way I did. Even if you did, you submitted the same documents that I did and the IRS told you you were wrong, well, you wouldn't know that the IRS made the mistake. And I think we need to pay attention in terms of tax fairness. We need to give a lot of thought to how low-income persons interact with the tax system, because it is not fair If a tax law professor can't figure it out, low-income persons are going to have a hard time. I would encourage you to think about funding for low-income taxpayer clinics and other measures to help those who are most vulnerable in our society. I wanted to emphasize as well that this should be a bipartisan effort. Both parties rely on the IRS for policy measures aside from the core revenue collection, whether we're talking about President Trump's stimulus payments or President Bush's tax cuts and the quick refunds or the implementation of the ACA. Everybody should want a strong IRS. And I want to echo Professor Letterman's statements about adequate funding. We, of course, want to make sure that money is not wasted by the IRS or anyone else, but the funding should be taken seriously, the funding issues. Lastly, and I suppose this folds a little bit into the Trump tax return fight, I hope that we can slow down the rhetoric a little bit about conflicts of interest facing IRS employees. My sister has been a government IRS or a DOJ attorney for 10 years. So she works on audits and disputes all the time. When she's at home, if President Trump appears on the television, she turns it off. If she's listening to NPR and he's on the radio, she can't stand his voice. But this idea that she or her colleagues are somehow in the pocket of the president and aren't doing their jobs carefully and faithfully and are just doing whatever he says is so offensive to her and to the morale of the thousands and thousands of people working at that agency. So I hope that unless we have some grounds for it, let's not allege that IRS employees are just doing the president's handiwork. And let's give respect to public servants who every day for a reasonable salary serve all of us. With that, I thank everyone for their attention.
I appreciate your comments, Mr. Graywall. Thank you very, very much. At this time, we'll open the hearing for questions. Without objection, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes to question our witnesses. If the witnesses will respond with short, concise answers, and by the way, the members try to make their questions short and concise, all members should be able to ask questions. As mentioned earlier, we will not observe the Gibbons rule in this remote setting. It will instead go in order of seniority for questioning, alternating between minority and majority, beginning with the members of the Oversight Committee. After all, subcommittee members have asked their questions. We move in seniority order to the off subcommittee members, alternating between minority and majority. Members are reminded to unmute yourselves when you are recognized for your 5 minutes. I will begin by recognizing myself for the questions. This question is for the entire panel. I want a yes or no answer. The Times reported that Mr. Trump paid $750 in taxes 2016, 2017, which is less than a school teacher in my district. This does not seem fair, it doesn't seem right, and it certainly doesn't seem patriotic. We need to know more. Should the president's federal tax returns be released to the public? I will start with the ambassador, and then we'll move on from there. So, Ambassador Eisen? Ambassador Eisen, do you hear me?
I can. Mr. Chairman, the answer is
Yes or no?
Yes, absolutely.
Professor Clark?
Yes, the president's tax return should be disclosed to the public.
Professor Letterman?
Yes.
Mr. Rosenthal?
Yes.
Professor Graywall?
Yes, if voluntarily.
This question is for Ambassador Eisen. Staggering lying and cheating and stealing revealed by the New York Times about Mr. Trump's tax returns confirm our worst fears. The report found Mr. Trump has $421 million in debt. How can we know if he or his government is advancing the interests of the nation or Mr. Trump's private interest? Please describe how this corruption, if it exists, affects Trump's ability to carry out his duties.
Mr. Chairman, the problem is that we can't know whether any of the president's decisions are motivated by the public interest, and we do know that a great many of his decisions are motivated by his personal and political interests to the expense of the public interest. The reason for this stems from his failure to divest himself of his conflicting financial interests. We've never seen anything like this in American history. And the result of that is because he has hung on to his businesses, over 3,400 conflicts of interest, Mr. Chairman. It has created a situation in which the American people cannot be confident when the president makes a decision not to go forward with the FBI headquarters plans across the street from his hotel. Does he have the best interests of the FBI, the country, and the people in mind, or does he not want a competing hotel? When he is campaigning for the Federal Reserve to reduce the federal fund interest rate, is that so he can get a lower interest rate on his massive debts? And on and on and on across personnel, across the decisions. We shouldn't have to ask the question. That is the core problem, and the Times reporting reveals it further.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Professor Clark, Mr. Trump has said that because he completes his annual government financial disclosures, there's no need for the public to see his tax returns. Do you agree with that conclusion?
No, I do not agree with that. The current system for disclosing the finances of the president and others has gaps, and some of those gaps would be revealed on tax returns. But I want to associate myself with the comments of Ambassador Eisen. This president has, nearly countless conflicts of interest, and we need to get a better handle on the president's debts, who his creditors are, and who his business partners are.
Well, last week I heard and listened at another committee meeting, which I was invited to by Congressman Connolly. I heard the IRS chief speak and say that the rich were not getting any leeway from the IRS. And I've heard from several of you today that the numbers are out of sight of how the poor are being audited so much more in percentage than those who are well off. That's pretty serious business. And Professor Letterman and Mr. Rosenthal, press reports indicate Mr. Trump treats his Seven Springs estate as an investment property. This allows him to avoid the alternative minimum tax and the SALT cap. What do you know about that? More than $2 million in local property taxes. Professor Letterman, Mr. Rosenthal, is it fair that President Trump can claim the SALT deduction while families in my state, New Jersey, can't? One rule for the average Joe, another for the wealthy and the powerful. Does this demonstrate profound unfairness in our tax system? Professor Letterman, please start.
Thank you. So the cap on the SALT deduction came in with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. So that cap is for 2018 and 2019, which my impression is that the New York Times did not have those returns. But you're making an excellent point that for ordinary individuals, there's that $10,000 cap for most state and local taxes, but it doesn't apply if you have a business and investment property. So I think the fairness issue here is whether the Seven Springs property is, as the Times reported, actually treated by President Trump as an investment property and whether that treatment is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal.
Mr. Chairman, I think you highlight a core issue from the New York Times reporting: the blending of personal and business expenses by President Trump. The ordinary Joe receives salaries, might have bonus or interest income, and income tax reporting is cut and dry. When you turn to business arrangements like pass-through businesses that can incur a wide range of expenses, some of which might arguably be personal as opposed to business, and might also be inflated as opposed to determined accurately. And the wage earner really doesn't have that kind of latitude. And so when a business, say, deducts a personal expense on behalf of the owner and deducts as a business expense, that ability, that latitude, is not something that the ordinary worker has.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Without objection, I'd like to enter into the record an article from the New York Times this past Sunday by Nicholas Kristof. It's entitled, "Who's the Tax Cheat? You Decide," which addresses this unfairness in our tax system. Hearing no objections, it is entered. Mr. Graywall, in your testimony, you note that your impression is that the leaks to the New York Times arose outside of the government. Could you elaborate on why you think that that's the case?
So again, I have no inside information, but we keep seeing leaks from the national security community, from the White House, the DOJ, everywhere. But it seems like over the last 30 years, hundreds, if not thousands of people must have seen some or all of Trump's tax return information and within the government. Yet I haven't seen any leaks of any sort until now. I would be surprised if right now a government employee decided to break his or her ethical obligations and the law and leaked information. My impression is that the leaks came from someone within Mr. Trump's financial orbit.
Well, thank you.
I'm like, not so.
Thank you for your response. And it would seem to me that your answer is very interesting in view of what I've heard so far today. But I thank you for your response, Mr. Graywall. I now recognize Mr. Kelly.
Thanks, Bill. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you, sir. Ambassador Eisen, are you suggesting that President Donald Trump did anything illegal when it came to his handling of his tax returns?
Mr. Kelly,
It's a yes or no. It's a yes or no question, Mr. Ambassador. Did he do anything illegal or didn't he?
we can't know the answer unless we have the full information. So
I
the
see.
thing that is, the core thing that is wrong, sir, if I just may offer a brief answer, the core thing that is wrong is that the president has broken with precedent to withhold the information we need. The question you asked, it's a very good question, Mr. Kelly.
Yeah, then please,
The
please
question
answer it.
you,
Please
the
answer.
question
It's a yes
you-
or no.
we
Ambassador, it's a
should,
yes or no.
we
Is
should
there
be
anything that you
able.
see that the president did wrong in his tax return? Is there something illegal? I'm just asking you whether you're a very good witness. I'm just asking you a real simple question. I'm trying to make my question brief so that your answer can be brief. So the question is yes or no. Did President Trump do anything illegal on his tax returns?
Based on the information that we have before us, I believe the president took an illegal $72 million
Okay,
deduction
so yeah.
because he
You-
did not abandon all interest.
Okay, let me move. You know, Ambassador, let me move on because I understand what you're saying. Professor Letterman, can you tell me? Are you suggesting that President Trump did anything illegal with his tax returns?
I did not suggest that, but I agree
thank you.
with Ambassador
Thank
Eisen. We cannot know without seeing the returns.
I see. And so why don't you get to see the returns?
They're confidential tax information protected by Section
Yeah,
6103.
they are confidential, and they're never supposed to be exposed to the public. So thank you for that, Professor Clark.
That applies to the IRS. It doesn't apply to.
Please ask you, Professor Clark. Are you suggesting that the president, Donald J. Trump, did anything illegal with his tax returns? Yes or no?
I think the New York Times article implies that he may
I
have.
didn't ask what the New York Times article implies. First, what they revealed is illegal. You know
Letter,
that, right?
Mr. Chairman, ranking member, whatever you want to call
Okay,
yourself
but-
today.
okay, but you know
Michael,
what? I'm
let her
just
finish
encouraged
her
by your
answer,
comments
please.
saying, make your question brief so the answer can be brief. These are yes or no questions. My question to the member of the panel is, do you believe that Donald Trump did something wrong? Are you saying?
If I thought the witnesses were not answering honestly and wanting to give you an answer, I would cut them off. But I don't believe that.
In some
And I'm the
cases,
chairman
very
and you're not.
yeah.
Go ahead, finish your answer to Mr. Kelly.
We know how it stacks up. It's all about who's in charge.
Not stacked up, not
Anyway,
stacked
so
up.
please, so Professor Clark.
You can talk as long as you want, but it's not stacked up.
Okay, all right. Well, I get it.
Well, it'd be a quick,
Yeah,
a
I
quick.
get it. Reclaiming my
Bring
time.
your-
Reclaiming my time,
Ms.
sir.
Clark, Professor
Reclaiming my
Clark, bring
time.
it to an end.
Suggesting the president did anything illegal with his tax returns.
I think the
Ms. Clark?
jury is out.
Finish.
You think what?
I think the jury is out, sir.
Yes or no? Did the president do something illegal?
We need more information to know
Oh, I see.
definitively.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
All right, I get that. Okay, Mr. Rosenthal, same question to you. Do you believe, are you suggesting that the president did anything illegal with his tax returns?
We need to define illegal. If I define illegal as a knowing violation of a duty of a statute, we do not yet have any evidence of that. We do not yet have an email or some other reflection that President Trump knowingly violated the law. But if we look at the term illegal as lay people look at this, and I answer many and questions from the press, did President Trump break the law? And here is how I answer that question. There is a range of behavior for taxpayers,
You know,
starting with perfectly lawful and ending with criminal conduct.
I appreciate your weighing in on it. Excuse me. It's my time. I appreciate your saying that, no, the president did not do anything illegal when it comes to his tax returns, but you'd like to see more information. And I would just tell you, I'm sure, in a fairness, when it comes to fairness, would you appreciate it if I had access to your tax returns so I could look at them and see if you did something illegal? We have a little thing called the rule of law. We have an agency called the IRS that's responsible for doing that. And we have an even greater, especially on this committee, to protect the rights of every single taxpayer, including the President of the United States. So thank you for being on the panel. So, Mr. Graywall, would you suggest that the president has done anything illegal based on any illegal leaking of the president's tax returns and printed in the New York Times, which is highly motivated in the opposite direction when it comes to this president? So, Mr. Graywall, are you suggesting that the president did anything wrong in his tax returns?
No serious or honest person would make criminal allegations based on a news article.
Yes. Thank you. I appreciate that testimony because I think that's what we're talking about. And I would just suggest that oversight, its main responsibility is protecting hardworking American taxpayers. It's not a political journey to look into nonprofits to see what we can do with them when it comes to 6103. It's about hardworking American taxpayers. And I would suggest that at times it really is hard for me to look at this and say we're doing what's right. And especially with this president, we've pursued him, not us, but other people pursued him since his election. So, Professor Graywall, now you've read all the New York Times reporting on the president's taxes. Is that right?
More comes out every day, but I've read quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, and we don't know where they got that information. Maybe somebody just dropped it off by chance. Now, are you in a position to adjudicate whether the president properly or improperly took any particular deduction or tax credit?
I would neither defend nor indict any particular position.
Why is that?
Because the New York Times did not disclose its sources or the underlying documents. All I have is reported characterizations, which might be right or which might be wrong. And most importantly, to commit tax evasion, a person has to know that they're breaking the law. We have no indications of the president's state of mind.
Well, I appreciate that answer because you do have a broad and
Thank you,
fair
Mr. Kelly.
understanding of the law. There's no laws broken. The only thing that's been broken
Mr.
is the
Kelly,
trust that
thank
the
you.
American people have in political parties that would use
this on?
their tax returns as a weapon, and stuff that was leaked, not the result of some investigation. I think it is absolutely horrible. It's un-American and it's unacceptable. And anybody to sit in this committee today and even question that is absolutely off the charts and out of order.
Mr. Kelly, need I remind you that several years ago, you joined in the purge of 10 citizens who provided their provide their tax returns in the investigation of Ms. Lerner, who was at that time the head of IRS. What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Right.
And how dare you point at certain things and you guys are the ones that started this. The gentleman's term is expired based on the members in attendance and consistent with the committee practice. We'll move to 2-to-1 questioning now. Chair now recognizes Ms. Del Bene for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. The New York Times reporting sheds light on two very different tax systems in America, one where hardworking people pay what they owe, and another where the rich and powerful use the tax code to avoid paying their fair share to the country that allowed them to prosper. I know since 2010, the IRS budget has been reduced by 20% in inflation-adjusted dollars, causing a 20% decline in overall staffing and a nearly 30% decline in enforcement staff. Earlier this year, I led an appropriations request calling for $14.5 billion in funding for the IRS, including at least $5.5 billion for the enforcement account and $500 million for business systems modernization. Professor Letterman, you talked about this a bit. To what extent has the decline in IRS funding and staffing in the last 10 years impacted the fairness of the IRS's examination program?
Those cuts have really hurt the IRS. It's hurt the IRS's examination program, and audits have declined more at the top. And in part, it's simply that when you have fewer resources, it's easier to use them on less complex returns. So most of the IRS's audits are correspondence audits, according to what the CBO reports and the IRS reports. And those are examinations that are done by mail. And so folks who have more complex tax situations, those take more time to audit. So the resource crunch has the unfair effect of kind of pushing the audit focus on sort of the simpler type of returns, which in general are going to be not those of higher income taxpayers.
So then can you speak, and kind of following up on that, how increasing the IRS's funding would bring a significant return on investment then?
Sure, yeah. For every dollar invested in the IRS's budget, there's a multiplier effect in terms of direct revenue collected. And then in addition to that, for every dollar in direct revenue collected, as I mentioned earlier, there's an estimate of about $4 to $12 of indirect revenue just through general deterrence.
And in what way does the New York Times article highlight the importance of IRS enforcement and audits?
Well, obviously we do not have the president's returns, and so we only have New York Times reporting on it. I always want to caveat with that, but it does highlight the importance of audits. It talks about the audit of allegedly President Trump claimed a $72.9 million refund, as you know, through the carryback of some losses. And that audit is apparently ongoing, as we heard earlier. And so we don't really have much of a window into the audit process. The New York Times reporting gives us some window into it, and it raises questions about how that audit is being carried out and to what extent are audits carried out differently for different types of taxpayers.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rosenthal, can you speak to how the president was able to exploit the federal tax system and the IRS by taking advantage of gray areas within federal tax law? For example, what makes it difficult for the IRS to deny the $70,000 hairstyling deduction?
Well, let's start with that simple example, Congresswoman. I think that's great. There are a variety of reasons why the president or Mr. Trump at the time might have been able to avoid paying his fair share of tax liability. And take the $70,000 expense for the hairstyling. That was presumably paid by one of his pass-through entities. And so it's very hard to find and audit the expenses and items that are passed through from another entity onto the president. Sometimes there's layers and layers of these. And so to even question an item takes a fair amount of looking. But let's talk about that hairstylist, because Congressman Kelly asked a very important question. Did the president break the law? Well, we in tax, and I've been practicing tax for 30 years, look at the law in a range. Is something perfectly legal, like deducting the hairstyling? It would be legal if it was purely a business-related expense. Maybe he washed his hair afterwards. Was it aggressive when President Trump took that deduction? If he actually went out and wore his hairstyle for his personal capacity? Yes, because the IRS position is if something can be used in your personal capacity, it cannot be deducted. Was it illegal in the sense, could he go to jail? Well, the first step is, did he commit negligence in reporting that number? Could there be civil fraud penalties in reporting that number? Or, as a later story said by Jim Stewart, he asserted that it was possible the president deducted the $70,000 hair expenses he was reimbursed for. Well, that would affix all sorts of civil penalties to it. And if we had an email from the president saying, I know that I was reimbursed, but let's go for it anyway, because this is buried in a pass-through entity and it'll never be found, that would cross the law into criminal violations of the law.
Thank you.
Ask, is it wrong or is it right? It's hard to say wrong or right.
The gentlelady's time has expired, and I'll let you finish your last sentence, Mr. Rosenthal.
Oh, I was just describing. There are separate questions about whether something is wrong, whether something is punishable by penalties, civil penalties, and whether someone can go to jail. But in all these circumstances, there is an element of impropriety that I believe the public deserves to know whether or not the president is perpetuating. Whether he goes to jail or not is a separate matter.
Thank you. Ms. Wolarski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Going through the what now?
Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
Thank you to the committee and the witnesses for being here today. You know, we've been down this road as a committee for a long time, and here we go again. The president is not legally required to disclose his tax returns. Talked about this before, and here we are again. He chose not to. The American people elected him as president anyway. Since then, Democrats have sought to weaponize the tax code to attain the president's tax returns purely for political gain, as we see on display right now. These efforts through the legal process have proved unsuccessful, but now someone has taken matters into their own hands by disclosing the president's private tax information to the New York Times without his consent. We've heard many allegations of wrongdoing on the part of the president without any actual evidence. And yet my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem entirely unconcerned with the only misconduct that we've seen with definitive evidence. That's the disclosure of the president's private tax information without his consent. Professor Graywall, is it correct that the public disclosure of an individual's private tax information without their consent can be criminal?
Depending on who does it.
Under what circumstances?
Typically, if someone from a government agency does it, it may be criminal, but if it's a friend of yours who's disclosing it, it may not be.
Professor Graywall, I understand there's a small number of ways that a disclosure of this nature may not violate criminal law. In such rare circumstances, wouldn't the disclosure still likely result in civil liability?
Well, it's almost certainly a breach of contract if you hire an accounting firm to do your taxes, presumably there's going to be an agreement that they keep your information confidential. And I would note the language from the New York Times story, which was a little weaselly, if I may. It referred to the person who provided the information had legal access to the returns. The story does not say that person had the authority to disclose. They just said that the person had access to the returns, which suggests to me, I don't know, but that they were not entitled to disclose.
And back to the concept of civil liability, what about professional ethics standards? For example, in the case of a bank employee, if in the same kind of situation in banking.
So I'm not familiar with all the accounting standards, but certainly the principles of the firm, or if an attorney violated confidences that way, I would not want to hire that person. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Professor Graywall, did the president break the law by not publicly releasing his tax returns?
There's no obligation for anyone to publicly disclose their tax returns.
Professor Graywall, do you know whether the president satisfied his legal requirements when he submitted his financial disclosure forms?
They're very long. I have not audited those disclosure forms. My impression is that the OGE has not raised any issues. That's all I can reasonably say.
Professor Graywall, if we accept the New York Times reporting is true, does the reporting lead you to believe the president broke the law in the filing of his tax returns?
Even the reporting itself, which can be contrasted from its coverage of Mr. Trump's father's returns, does not imply criminality. They did imply criminality with respect to his father, but the report itself does not, even taken at face value.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, the gentlelady. And I want to say this to the gentlelady, who's always been fair and direct. You claim that one of us in the Congress, therefore, has leaked to the New York Times. Who?
Are you
And
saying,
where's your
Mr.
proof?
Chairman, that a member of Congress?
I'd like to know
Is
who
that
did
what you're
this.
saying?
I'm sorry?
I said, are you saying that somebody in Congress leaked this information to the New York Times? Is that what you're saying?
No, but it sure as heck sounded like you said that. Correct me.
Really?
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Interesting. I'm just simply asking the question as anybody else would, because this law pertains to all of us. And I know if it was me being hung out to dry with no evidence whatsoever, I'd want to know every single detail. And I wanted to know what that professor thought.
Just in conclusion, there's plenty of evidence. Whether it's criminal is the question. And we want to know, as Mr. Eisner said just a few moments ago, we want to know. That's why we need the tax returns.
Mr. Chairman?
That's why we in the Congress need the tax returns.
Mr.
And
Chairman?
our story is not over. That has not been settled, that issue.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. I didn't come here to argue with you. I'm not going to sit here very long and listen to you argue with me. I asked the gentleman the question, he answered the questions, and I yield back the rest of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Now I'd like the gentlelady, Ms. Sanchez from California. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I get to my questions, I want to take a moment again to express my sincere sympathies to Chairman Lewis's family and staff. It was an honor for me to work with him, and I know for his staff, it was an honor to work for him. You lost your captain too soon, and he's truly missed, especially on this subcommittee that he led with such conviction and such dignity. To our new chairman, Mr. Pasquarello, I know your chairmanship will continue our committee's important mission, and I look forward to working with you in your new role.
Thank you very much.
I want to begin by thanking our panel of distinguished witnesses for joining us today to help us distill fact from fiction. Recent news reports have exposed the extent to which the IRS has been unfairly focusing on the wrong population. All taxpayers must abide by the law, but there is currently a tale of two tax systems in this country. The audit rate for taxpayers earning over $1 million a year has been cut in half. The IRS continues to rely on an examination program that focuses on auditing low-income taxpayers because it's cheaper and it's easier for them. It's the low-hanging fruit. Professor Lederman, how do audits impact tax compliance and deter taxpayers from cheating?
So audits have multiple effects. First of all, they collect direct revenue. So Audits bring in revenue directly for the federal government. And then, as I mentioned before, they have a really important indirect effect from returns. There's been various studies with a range of numbers that for every dollar collected directly, the range is estimated at $4 to $12 of indirect effect on voluntary compliance, meaning that people timely and voluntarily pay their tax obligations.
Thank you, Professor. I think that, nobody really loves paying taxes, but they really hate when they think the system is screwing them and that certain people are getting off scot-free. Drilling down on the topic a bit more, there is a $441 billion gross tax gap, according to the most recent estimate. What is the relationship between the tax gap and higher income audit levels?
So the tax gap is the difference between taxes due and taxes timely and voluntarily paid. And so you mentioned the $441 billion gross tax gap. That is reduced by enforcement by about $60 billion. This is annually, so you end up with about a $381 billion net tax gap. This is according to the most recent IRS estimates. And increasing audit rates increases compliance. That reduces the tax gap. And, for one of the biggest components of the tax gap is actually individual taxpayers' business income. And so more audits there, those are generally more complex returns, would increase the direct revenue and then thereby increase voluntary compliance. And all that helps to shrink the tax gap.
Now, I used to teach, and it's kind of like I look at it as like a teacher overseeing her students so that they're not cheating on their exams. If they know that somebody is watching them and paying attention, they're more likely to do their own work independently. They're more likely to comply. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my red light camera analogy, that, you don't use it only for enforcement. And of course, lots of people are going to obey the law, whether or not they're being watched. But people know they're being watched. For the most part, that kind of helps keep everyone honest.
Thank you. Turning to another troubling issue that has been highlighted repeatedly in the press, the ongoing lack of transparency regarding our president's finances undermines our democracy or poses a threat actually to our national security. Professor Clark, is the president's debt concerning to you?
Yes, it absolutely is. President Trump, according to the New York Times, has over $300 million in debt coming due in the next 4 years. And although that may not make him insolvent, he may have difficulty paying off that debt or, renegotiating it, refinancing it, which means, and this really gets to your question, he is subject to influence and leverage. And as a couple of national security experts wrote in the Washington Post, I believe on Sunday, with that much debt, President Trump absolutely would have been denied a security clearance if he were treated like other government employees are treated. So yes, it is a concern.
And would your concern about the president's debt be lessened if his assets were, say, liquid and available to pay the debt?
Yes, I think that's correct. If debt has to be looked at in context. So if it's $300 million of debt coming due, but he has a massive amount of liquid assets available to pay that off, then that suggests that he wouldn't be subject to the same kind of leverage than if this is going to cause, put pressure on him.
Great. I thank you again to all our panel of witnesses, and I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, gentlelady. And now we're going to turn to Mr. Swazi of New York. Mr. Swazi, your time, it begins.
Witnesses. Oh, you hear me now? Oh, I guess I was muted. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses. I'm so grateful for the time that you've spent here with us today. Professor Graywall, you said in your testimony that you've written a lot about the president's taxes. And Ranking Member Kelly said in his closing remarks of his last section that the president has done nothing illegal. Can you confirm the fact that the president has done nothing illegal?
Of course not. I'm not in a position to evaluate Dr.
So you can't confirm the president's done nothing illegal.
I just operate from a presumption of innocence. I don't accuse people of breaking the law unless I have facts in front of me.
Okay, but we don't have those facts, right?
That is correct. That's the IRS's job.
Mr. Graywall, the New York Times said that the president paid $750 in taxes in 2016 and 2017. The president says that's not true. Can you tell us what the truth is?
Not without seeing any tax returns and related documents.
Mr. Graywall, Professor Graywall, is it true that every president since President Nixon has disclosed their taxes to the public with the exception of President Trump?
I think maybe Ford released a transcript as opposed to a full return. I might be mistaken, but certainly the general tenor of presidents is to make full disclosures.
So, Professor Graywall, the president has broken with that tradition.
He is a non-traditional president, that's for certain.
Thank you. Mr. Graywall, Professor Graywall, is it accurate to say that the IRS manual requires that every president and every vice president be audited by the IRS?
Yeah, after Watergate and the associated issues, the manual was amended to require careful double audits, in fact, of the president.
Professor, do we know whether or not the president has been audited by the IRS?
I believe that the Ways and Means Committee or this subcommittee met with persons from the IRS in charge of those Internal Revenue Manual audits. I was not present, but perhaps your committee would know.
Do you know whether or not the president's been audited by the IRS?
I do not have any inside information.
Do you know whether or not the president's audit was done the appropriate way?
I do not have any inside information.
Do you think it's reasonable for this committee to request the president's tax return so we can determine whether in fact he's been audited?
I would request you do the same thing that a couple of colleagues on the other side in the Senate did. I believe Senator Schumer and another of his colleagues requested a Treasury Inspector General investigation into the into the IRS's audits of the president's returns. I think that is the most responsible way to go about this, the way that your Senate colleagues have done.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Lederman, thank you so much for the information that you provided us. I just want to confirm a couple things. Professor Lederman, is the IRS budget today less than it was in 2010?
In inflation-adjusted dollars, yes.
And is it accurate to say that there are 30,000 less employees in the IRS today than there were in 2010?
I don't have the exact staffing numbers in front of me. I know that the staff has been cut a lot, but I don't have that exact number.
The number I have is 30,000 less, that there were over 100,000 employees in 2010, and today there are 78,000 employees. And the other information I have is that the number of auditors, the number of revenue agents today is the lowest it's been since 1954. Does that sound accurate to you?
I don't have those precise numbers, but they don't surprise me.
Is it sound reasonable to you that the number of people audited today is about 1 in 90, whereas in 2010 it was today it's 1 out of every 220 people, which is about 0.5% of the people are audited. Whereas in 2010 it was 1 out of every 90, which is over 1% of the people who were audited.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yes, that's right. Right. For returns that were examined in 2019, it's 0.4% for individuals overall, 0.7% for corporations overall, and then for returns examined in 2010, it was over 1%, 1.1% for individuals overall, and 1.4% for corporations overall.
Just so I have some information from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that says the audit rate for millionaires has gone down by 61% since 2010. The audit rate for largest corporations has gone down by 51%, and the audit rate overall has gone down by 45%. Thank you very much.
The time for Mr. Swazi, the gentleman from New York, is expired. And now we're going to call, thank you. And now we're going to call on Ms. Chu from California.
Professor Letterman, your testimony points to several instances where the IRS's limited staffing and resources undermines audits and tax compliance, which in turn contributes to the tax gap. I can understand that because in California, I was elected to California's tax board, where we had oversight over tax compliance. And we also saw that the largest contributors to the tax gap are the high-income individuals like President Trump, who use the tax loopholes and complicated tax schemes to avoid paying their fair share. Your testimony also notes that the recent Congressional Budget Office estimates that increasing the IRS's funding to investigate these high-income individuals would more than pay for itself by allowing the IRS to effectively collect unpaid taxes from the wealthiest individuals. And by increasing the examinations and collections budget by $20 billion over 10 years, it would increase revenues by $61 billion. And if it's increased by $40 billion over 10 years, it would increase revenues by $103 billion. I just find it outrageous that we're in a situation now where someone earning less than $20,000 would be more likely audited than someone who earns more than $400,000. So how does the year-to-year funding for the IRS hamper its operations? And how would the country benefit from a permanent funding for the IRS or multi-year, as Commissioner Reddick suggested last week?
So, yeah, you're pointing to the Congressional Budget Office's report about how much of a direct effect an increase in the IRS's budget would have. And certainly, the IRS has experienced not only budget cuts in real dollars over the last 10 years, but also that uncertainty from one year to the next about how much funding it's going to get. And so increasing its funding would give a great return on investment, as I've said before. And certainly if the IRS is going to be able to continue to invest in personnel, in hiring and training, in cybersecurity and technology, et cetera, it's really helpful to be able to know that that funding is going to be able to continue into the future as the IRS tries to ramp up and hire to increase enforcement, service, et cetera. I'll stop there unless you want more about how audits are helpful for compliance.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you. And Mr. Rosenthal and Ms. Letterman, the reporting in the New York Times is appalling, but not shocking to anyone paying attention to how this president disregards the rule of law when it applies to him. In a settlement with the state of New York last November, the president admitted to misusing funds given to his personal charity, the Trump Foundation. It was money given to donors expecting that it would be used on charitable causes, but instead given to funnel money to himself for legal payments for other Trump operations, as well as campaign and personal expenses. President Trump was forced to dissolve the Trump Foundation under court supervision. And in November of 2016, President-elect Trump was forced to pay a fine to the IRS using the Trump Foundation for using the Trump Foundation to make an illegal $25,000 campaign contribution. And so he's had an established record for abusing the tax system for his own gain. So understanding that there are these gray areas that allow for him to deduct for $70,000 for his own hairstylist, let's address this. Mr. Rosenthal, you said there was no way to verify income for these sole proprietors. And Ms. Letterman, you talked about the need for third-party income verification. Could you say how we can reduce these gray areas, such as in disclosures of income from LLCs, such as what New York is doing right now?
Well, I think Professor Letterman and I both noted last week the Treasury Inspector General wrote a report to the IRS pointing out how difficult it was to audit sole proprietorships because they often could claim very large losses, even though they had very, very little income that they were reporting. And the Treasury Inspector General asked the IRS to pursue a variety of remedies, including a case study, which seemed reasonable to me. But the IRS refused, saying that that was too labor intensive and too difficult. And the IRS correctly noted that there had been a lot of changes. There are new LLC audit rules and things of that sort. that might yet help. And so Congress is aware generally that there are problems in this area, although I must say, in my view, the Congress makes it worse many times by adding or layering on new deductions, like the 20% pass-through deduction, which creates all the more complexity and difficulty for the IRS to unravel things. But this will be time intensive. But that's not an excuse to just audit low-income taxpayers, because it's hard to audit high-income taxpayers or those with businesses. I don't mean to apologize for that.
The gentle lady's time has expired. I want to thank her for her questions. And I'd like to call on now my good friend from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore. The gentle lady from Wisconsin. Gwen,
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to associate myself with the comments of everyone who has indicated how wonderful it is to have you as our subcommittee chairman. And we're going to continue to have good trouble on this subcommittee. I don't know where to start. We have such excellent testimony today, and I have so many questions, and I only have 5 minutes. I guess one of the things that our good friends and our members on the other side have continued to sort of indicate or implicate is that the president perhaps has done nothing illegal, and the defense always is that people are entitled to be clever and to use the tax code to their benefit, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they've done anything wrong. And I can't remember who it was that gave the great example, and I'm gonna try to figure it out. If you go take something out on the street and throw it away, if you abandon it, that has one sort of tax treatment, as opposed to whether or not you sell it for $1, and that's an entirely different tax treatment. And if you're clever enough to figure out which one gets you the most money, that shouldn't be held against you. So I guess with that, I would like to just ask you all about a few things. The New York attorney is examining the president's tax returns now to try to see whether or not there have been inflated values with regard to getting loans. Would that be something that would be allowed? I guess maybe I'm asking Professor Lederman or anyone else. Would that be one of the things that would be considered as just being clever?
It doesn't sound to me like you're asking about a federal tax issue per se, so I'll just say briefly and then yield to others.
Right. How about the issue of the abandonment issue?
Okay.
Is that an honest mistake? You know, he said he abandoned the casinos and then took a 5% interest in the new business. Is that an honest mistake? Is that something legitimate that would not incur any sort of penalties or criminal behavior?
So, as always, we haven't seen his returns. We only have the New York Times reporting, and
but is that something that's kind of okay to do? Or to
could I share?
How about the gift tax? If you give your kids a consulting fee, would that be something that would be an appropriate way to avoid taxes, and you're just being clever?
Okay, I think I see what you're getting at. And so, sorry, there's a bit of an echo. Let me turn this down. I think that the question here, and I can't recall who raised it earlier, it might have been Professor Graywall, about whether any actions that the president is alleged to have taken might have been compliant, might have been negligent, might have been fraudulent, or might have been willful in nature. We can't know, but there's a real difference between simply arranging your actual affairs to fit within a more favorable tax provision rather than a less favorable versus making a claim about facts that aren't true.
I want to ask you one more question. Okay, I want to ask another question. My time is limited.
And they didn't, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
Gentle lady, please excuse me. Somebody has an open mic.
Okay. That might be me.
Ms. Moore?
Am I recognized, sir? Mr. Chairman, am I recognized?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I was wondering if the joint the Job Cut and Tax Act, has that created the creation of more pass-throughs? Has that given a greater opportunity to the president, given the structure of his businesses, to claim more deductions? We haven't seen his returns for 18 or 19, but would you say that that creates yet even more Schedule C opportunities
If you would like
for the
me
president
to,
to
I can
avoid
say yes.
taxation?
Congresswoman, I would say the answer. Go on.
Okay,
I think the answer
Professor
is
Rosenthal.
yes, the 20% deduction affords additional opportunities for businesses that are pass-throughs. And President Trump has 500 pass-through businesses in his empire. So I would expect that he benefited from that 20% deduction.
Okay, thank you. I'm so sorry that I don't have any more time. I would yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. We still have an open mic somewhere. And please cease and desist. Now it's stopped. Anyway, our next batter up is the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle.
Thank you. And I want to first echo the words that were said by my colleague Linda Sanchez, just expressing still the profound sadness that I have over the passing of an American hero and our chairman emeritus, John Lewis. I also want to congratulate my good friend, Bill Pascrell, on assuming the chairmanship, and it's an honor to serve with him and serve under his chairmanship. This issue is frustrating, I think, to most of the working class and middle class constituents in my district, who on average make about $40,000 a year, to find out that many of them will have paid more in taxes than the president of the United States, who at the least makes millions but claims to be a billionaire. So the question is then, given what was reported that 10 of the last 15 years, President Trump paid zero in taxes, and then those rare years in which he did pay federal income tax, he paid $750. The question in my mind then is, to what extent is this because of illegality? To what extent is this because of massive loopholes in our tax system that treats the top 1% very differently? Or to what extent is it actually a combination of those two, since this is not mutually exclusive? So let's use Trump as actually a window into perhaps a larger issue, especially if it's the second thing that I mentioned. So let me ask Mr. Rosenthal perhaps first, if you could comment and offer an educated guess as to which of those menu of options I presented might be the answer.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. And the second portion of my written testimony goes extensively to the question of whether President Trump's business losses were fair. And by fair, I only mean they should be allowed if they were genuine and accurate. And whether they were genuine and accurate is a hard question to assess from our standpoint here. I actually looked very closely at President Trump's $916 million of losses that he incurred in the 1990s. I helped the New York Times with their story. They gave me bankruptcy filings, attorney-client privilege opinions that have been disclosed in the bankruptcy court. And I discovered that President Trump took a position that his lawyers told him would be unlikely to succeed if challenged. And in my view, the position was nearly frivolous. And if found with the $960 million of losses, I think the president would have been subjected to interest and penalties. Would he go to jail? Well, it's very hard to go to jail when the law is so complex you can't sort it out. And to what extent was this a problem in the tax code? Well, there was a problem in the tax code, but the president exploited what was some ambiguity into a gross distortion. I think very far beyond what other what other practitioners or taxpayers would do. And so, yes, the tax code has systemic issues to it. It's complex, but there are taxpayers who are more aggressive than others, and where they are on the spectrum of perfectly lawful to criminal violations varies from transaction to transaction.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer. Moving forward, again, both for Mr. Trump specifically, but individuals like him who might be engaging in the same behavior, or then just more generally, those who perhaps are not as aggressive or outright committing fraud, but are still able to take advantage of generous loopholes. What are a thing or some things you would recommend to this committee to focus on as we look perhaps at a reform of the tax code early next year?
Well, from my perspective, if that question is addressed to me, I published an article on how President Trump managed to accumulate $960 million of losses based on my review of documentation. One of the things he did was he continued to accrue interest on loans that were never going to be paid, even though his lender did not accrue the income because they said the interest was never going to be paid. And so that was a mismatch, allowing the outstanding deductions by President Trump's businesses not to be offset by income from the lender. In a footnote, I suggested Congress should correct that problem. That's one.
Great. All right, with 1 second, I yield back.
I want to thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for his questions, and because we're not just examining one individual here under 6103, someone in the executive branch of government, but we are talking about the general necessity of changing the code, because the lower end of the shtick is getting the lower end of the shtick. This has been shown in many, many committees throughout the Congress. I want to thank him for his questions. And now I want to ask the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett. Thank you for being here.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. And I couldn't agree with you more than this last comment you made about how unfair our tax code is to those at the lower end of the income scale, and how our implementation and enforcement of our tax code is the same. When you look at income inequality and the growing gap between working people and the 1% of the 1%, you see the effect in large measure of the tax laws that have been written in this committee, and the failure of this committee through the years to stand up and demand full enforcement of our laws to ensure that what we do right, even the various exemptions and preemptions and special treatment, that law is rigidly enforced. That has not happened, and it really is a much broader agenda that we need to cover. Indeed, to the extent that the only defense that our Republican colleagues offer today is, did he do anything illegal? You have to ask, why could it possibly be legal to do some of the things that the president apparently did in his business dealings? And so there are laws that need to be changed, but he seems to have stretched the existing laws to such an extent that there's considerable question, if we ever get the full returns, that he did some things that were contrary to the law. Indeed, we could not have a meaningful hearing today, but for the strong investigative reporting by the New York Times, and I guess one or more whistleblowers, because they got the very kind of documents, Mr. Chairman, that you and I, in my case, I think about half a dozen times tried to get in the last Congress and were never successful in being able to get, as our Republican colleagues objected to any broad inquiry on these returns. President Trump has said that he views tax dodging as a sport. But as we've heard today from our excellent witnesses, it's a sport where only those in Trump's category can win and even afford to play. As Ms. Chu referenced earlier, the top 0.5% of the wealthiest Americans account, we believe, according to the analysis, for 1/5 of the income that is hidden from the IRS. Though one study found that the super rich are the most likely to cheat on their taxes, the audit rates for those at the top have gone down. Meanwhile, working families who claim the earned income tax credit are more likely to get audited than these super rich. Our tax laws have been, and their implementation have been, an engine of economic inequality. Mr. Rosenthal, I'd like to start with how Trump, as a loser in most of his business endeavors, foisted his losses off on individual taxpayers, small businesses that were paying their taxes. The impressive investigative journalism has uncovered what Congress was unable to accomplish, and that is disclosure of really what a loser he has been and how desperate he is to seek personal gain at taxpayer expense, really a taker, not a maker. We've heard commentators say that he's either a terrible businessman or a tax cheat. Isn't there evidence to suggest both?
Well, certainly President Trump lost staggering amounts of money. He borrowed money from banks and from public lenders, and he spent it, lost it, and deducted it. And then when his loans were forgiven, he failed to report income that would have reduced his losses. So the big picture is he ran through a lot of money, and then he failed to include income that the tax law generally requires to be included through aggressive reporting.
And isn't the loss carryback provision on which he relied very similar to the one that Republicans right now are demanding in relief legislation? They included it in the CARES Act. We've tried to repeal it. A loss carryback provision that allows for the carryback of these huge losses to avoid paying any taxes when there is a good year.
Yes, I described President Trump nearly $1 billion loss that he used as currency to avoid paying taxes all the way through to 2005. And then for 3 years, he had income. But in 2009, there was a $700 million loss that popped up that looks somewhat suspicious. He was allowed, as part of 2009 special carryback legislation, up to 5 years to carry back that loss and erase the income that he paid in earlier years and paid taxes. Analogous to what Congress did in the CARES Act to afford more flexibility to carry back losses. And may I say, President Trump claimed in 2009 what so many taxpayers are claiming this year, quickie refunds. The government writes a check first and then audits later. So in 2010, the government wrote President Trump a check, and we're now in 2020, and they're still arguing, the IRS and President Trump, whether or not writing that check was appropriate.
I want to thank Mr. Rosenthal for that last answer, and I want to thank the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, for your great questions. And now we're going to call on Ambassador Eisenhower. Before, I know you need to go, but I wanted to thank you for being here today and having a great presentation and answering the questions. And I'm sure Mr. Kelly feels the same way. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Eisen, Professor Eisen.
Thanks, Chairman, and I thank the ranking member as well.
Thank you very much. Our next gentleman up for questions is my friend from Chicago, Mr. Davis. Gentlemen, the gentle gentleman is up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for letting me wave onto this hearing. I want to associate myself with many of the concerns expressed by my colleagues as they talked about the president's tax return. And I do think that he has done something wrong. As a matter of fact, I think he's done many things that are wrong. They may not have been illegal, but they are wrong. Like other systems in our country, the Internal Revenue Service, Treasury, and our tax code advance policies that are racially discriminatory. Policies that on their face appear race neutral but in practice exact a steep toll from communities of color. Although economists estimate that the top 1% are responsible for 70% of tax underpayments, the 5 counties with the highest audit rates in the United States are predominantly African American, followed closely by Latinx counties in Texas and South Dakota counties with Native American reservations. All of this is unbelievable. Counter to law, Treasury denied economic impact payments to incarcerated individuals and their families, thereby inflicting economic harm disproportionately on African Americans, Latinx, and indigenous persons who are overrepresented in our prison system. Treasury justified its position to the Congressional Black Caucus by arguing that the incarcerated did not deserve the aid because they are not working, had no economic need, or were fraudulent. Shameful. Like Fannie Lou Hamer said, I am tired of being sick and tired. And I'm tired of hearing colorblind justifications for discrimination. Ida B. Wells said, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. As discussed in Bloomberg Tax Story, I plan to introduce legislation that would collect demographic tax data in an effort to shine the light on racial inequities. Professor Lederman or Mr. Rosenthal, I want to improve tax fairness for racial, ethnic, and low-income communities. Knowing that the median net worth of white families is nearly 10 times that of Black households, I'd like to ask what policies could help ensure that the wealthier taxpayers are paying their fair share so that the lower income taxpayers are not overly burdened. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit to the record articles by ProPublica about audit patterns, as well as an article by Bloomberg Tax regarding how tax code inequities fuel call for the Internal Revenue Service to collect race-based data. And I would appreciate that. And if I could get a response from Mr. Lederman, Mr. Rosenthal, and Dr. Lederman.
If I will take a short answer to suggest something that's within Congress's power, which is to be sensitive to the racial impacts of relief. For example, as part of the CARES Act, the first round of the Payroll Protection Program was devised in a fashion that large businesses, and I think have been found to be more racially homogenous, white, benefited more heavily. And in fact, there were tax benefits in that Payroll Protection Program, including a double dip that I've written about. And those benefits go to the biggest and most established businesses in lieu of going to more diverse crowds. Congress got sensitive to that in the second round. But I would suggest to Congress that you can place income tests on relief, not just provide, say, in the stimulus package, money for everybody. Try to target the money at least to the low income beneficiaries. That's what I would say was within your power. And I defer to the professor on what could be done in audit.
Thank you. So a progressive income tax reduces income inequality. There's research that shows that. And given the income inequality by race, you want to support progressivity. And part of that is that progressivity of the code itself. But part of that is if there are insufficient audits at the top, then you undermine that progressivity. So making sure that there's a fair structure of audits where the high income are being audited, at least proportionally, absolutely helps progressivity and income inequality, and therefore should also be helpful with the kinds of issues you're referring to.
Balance of my time.
This time is up. Your two articles will be entered into the record, Mr. Davis, without objections. Our next questioner will be Ms. Sewell from Alabama. The gentle lady is on board.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our guests today, and I also want to associate myself with all of my colleagues' comments on congratulating you on being the new chair. You obviously have huge shoes to fill. We will miss Congressman Lewis each and every day. But Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for holding this important and timely hearing. The investigation of Donald Trump's tax return raises many issues that demand the urgent attention of Congress, and it is clear that the American people deserve a more thorough examination of this information before the November 3rd election. The reports from the New York Times are indeed very troubling, but not surprising. The notion that President Trump pays little to nothing in income taxes while working class families follow the letter and spirit of the law should be of concern to everyone. If President Trump took advantage of loopholes in existing laws to eliminate his tax liability, those loopholes need to be closed. And if he violated the law, then he must be held accountable. This is a case of a self-reported billionaire paying less in taxes than the average worker in my district. The nurses, construction workers, teachers that help our communities and our society thrive. But the case of Donald Trump is just one example, an egregious one, I would suggest, of the broader issues within our tax enforcement system. We have an unlevel playing field that is tilted against workers and families in my district and in favor of the ultra wealthy. I want to associate myself with the comments of Dr. Davis, who preceded me, in asking very pointed questions about race. For me, when I look at my district, the shady accounting maneuvers and delay tactics used by Donald Trump are just common tools used by the wealthy. And I look at my district and see how disproportionately targeted rural and low income workers, especially those who receive the earned income tax credit. For example, in the Black community of my district, Greene County, where it's 60 to 70% African American and has a median income level of only $21,000 a year, but families in Greene County, Alabama, are audited 40% more than the national average. I think this is not only unacceptable, but I think it's also blatantly discriminatory. The IRS should reprioritize their investigations and enforcements towards wealthy evaders like Donald Trump and not towards low-income rural communities where people are barely struggling. My question really is to both Mr. Rosenthal as well as Professor Lederman. How does the disproportionate auditing of the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit recipients, especially in low-income and rural communities, contribute to the unfairness in our tax system? And more importantly, what can Congress do to improve tax compliance, especially among the wealthiest taxpayers? Mr. Rosenthal, you first, or
I can go first. Sure. I think it's well reported that the IRS is auditing EITC recipients at a rate equal or higher than those who make more than $200,000 of income. And if you look to the tax gap, because the dollars are smaller with EITC audits than there would yet be for like business owners audits, they're not looking where the money is. And I think that largely this is an institutional inertia, that it's easy to do an EITC audit with information matching and hard to go after sole proprietorships, Schedule Cs, or LLCs, Schedule Es, much, much harder.
Yes, I know I'm running out of time, and I do want Professor Lederman to address that. But I also have a really pointed question to Kathleen Clark that I'd like to propose now. As a member of the House Intelligence Committee, I'm also concerned about the security implications of the New York Times investigation. What national security considerations arise from President Trump's financial conflict of interest and personal debt obligations, and what safeguards and transparency measures should Congress implement to minimize these conflicts of interest in the current administration and in future administrations? Kathleen, could you answer that question regarding the security implications, national security implications?
Yes, absolutely. You raise a very good point. President Trump's debts and, frankly, his business interests in foreign countries and foreign countries' business or patronizing of his businesses absolutely create conflicts of interest, counterintelligence threats. And so one thing that Congress can do is require financial disclosure, amend the financial disclosure laws so that it requires the president and others to disclose business relationships that are not currently captured by the financial disclosure requirements.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing my witness to.
You're welcome. And that last question was a real doozy. Interesting question, which opens up, and we're talking a lot more than just one person's tax returns here. I want everybody to understand that. We're talking, and that's why we're going to have more meetings and more committee meetings before we get to Brad in the future to deal with this subject of a runaway tax code and whether the resources they have in the IRS are enough to capture these nuances that we've been all referring to today. Now I'd like to ask the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider. Thank you for being here, Mr. Schneider.
Thank
The
you.
floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join with all of my colleagues in obviously mourning the loss of an icon and an amazing person like John Lewis, but welcoming you to the position of chairman. I look forward to working with you, and I'm grateful today to be allowed to join the hearing, this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses as well. We've been discussing today three key issues: fairness, compliance, and the tax gap, and they're all interrelated. And I think something that's become clear in this conversation is that we face challenges around all three of these in the skew towards unfairly advantaging those at the top. Much of the conversation today has been about President Trump's filings and possible abuses of the tax code in our system of compliance for his own benefit. Actions like those reported end up putting an unfair burden on taxpayers who follow the letter of the law and cheat our nation's treasury. But it's not just individual income taxes that are an issue. I'd like to use my time today to discuss the related issues of abuses within the preferred status we provide to our nonprofits. Last year, it was widely reported that the NRA was wantonly abusing their tax status, for example, funneling money through its PR firm, Ackerman McQueen, to launder perks for their CEO, Wayne LaPierre, and other executives. Subsequent to those initial reports, I've worked over the last couple of years to better understand the alleged abuses and highlighted these abuses in a report we issued earlier this year. There are detailed cases of private inurement that would be in direct violation of the NRA's tax privilege status. For example, reports of a plan to purchase a $6 million home on behalf of Mr. LaPierre with tax-preferred funds, hundreds of thousands of dollars for high-end clothing, and also similar amounts for extravagant travel for he and his wife. There are also instances of apparent conflict of interest. Such allegations are obviously anathema to the NRA's tax-exempt status. Because of the special status the NRA, like other exempt nonprofits, enjoy, the American people are effectively subsidizing its operations. For this reason, we rightly expect honesty and integrity in the financial operations of these organizations. Abuse of their tax status hurts all of us. So, Professor Lederman, if I can turn to you, in your testimony, you noted that, I'll quote you, enforcement of our tax laws is an important part of taxpayer fairness. And so I'd like your thoughts. How have diminished enforcement resources within the IRS and the consequent brain drain associated with it affected the IRS's ability to enforce our tax code fairly?
Yeah, so no one wants to feel like the only chump who's complying with their tax obligations, feeling like others are kind of getting away with non-compliance. And so in order to enforce the tax laws, the IRS needs sufficient resources. There's no question about that. It has to have the resources in order to be able to enforce the laws with respect to all kinds of taxpayers, high-income individuals, entities, et cetera.
So I was going to say,
No,
I mean, if we had more effective, more comprehensive enforcement, in this case, focusing on the nonprofit world, how would that promote fairness? What impact do you think it would have on reducing abuses of the tax code, like what we've seen alleged with the National Rifle Association?
Well, I think with respect to tax exempt organizations, we have to remember that it really wasn't that long ago that Congress was saying that, was accusing the IRS of targeting certain tax exempt organizations. And I have written about that. And I think that has really, that undermined the IRS's ability to enforce Section 501, which deals with tax exempt organizations. So I do think that the rhetoric that Congress uses about the IRS is incredibly important. And so, I mean, it was 2013, as I recall, when there were hearings on that. And so it's just, it's fairly recent memory for the IRS. So I would keep that in mind in terms of, simply like both in terms of the rhetoric used about the IRS and allowing the IRS to do its job with respect to enforcing the laws that relate to tax exempt organizations as well as to everyone else.
No, thank you. I think that's critically important. This is not about the mission or objectives of any tax exempt organization. It's the idea that every tax exempt organization needs to follow the law. The money going into those, the donors are contributing for the mission and purpose, not to buy the executive a house or a fancy suit. And it's true no matter what organization it is. So I think that compliance is necessary to make sure all of our tax exempt organizations follow the law and the American taxpayer is protected. With that, my time is up. Again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for letting me join you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank you, Brad, for the great job you've been doing on leading oversight efforts of taxation and nonprofits like the NRA. And this subcommittee works to support those efforts. But thank you.
I'm very grateful.
And I want to thank Ambassador Norm Eisen. I want to thank Kathleen Clark, Leandra Letterman, Steve Rosenthal, and Mr. Graywall. All five of you have done an outstanding job in responding to multiple questions. I want to thank you all for doing that. And I think join with me in thanking the staff that's done a great job today in preparing quickly for this hearing. I want to thank them for who they are. For instance, Karen McAfee, Danielle Brown, our parliamentarian, Susan Athey, Isabella Moore, Alaya Manjak, and also Jane Fitzgerald from our office directly. In closing, I would like to thank our witnesses for joining us. Please be advised that the members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. I want to thank the ranking member, and we'll be together on Tuesday on the ACA, which should be a nice, calm meeting. with that, the subcommittee stands adjourned. God bless.